Hello, this is Pacific.ca from Nanaimo this time with the local MP, Jean Crowder. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
The social services in Canada have been in the upswing for many years after the Second World War, and then I don't know when the turn around and start getting eroded with different administrations. You remember when was that turnaround from building social services and to going down? You remember which administration was more or less?
Well, one of the most significant events was back in 1995-96 when Paul Martin was the finance minister. And at that point in time, what happened was the government imposed funding caps across a number of different government departments. And it really was under the Liberals in 95-96 that corner was turned in terms of investments. People think of them as expenses, but they're actually investments in people with regards to social services.
Yeah, good. Just going back briefly into this turnaround from building social services to eroding them. I had in mind, I was looking into Mulrooney years, Brian Mulrooney, which was before Martin and Chrétien. Did he do some cutting of social services that time?
There certainly were some cuts, but I know sort of in the last 25 years, it was the Martin government, the Paul Martin finance government, that really put the cap on social service spending. There certainly was some things that happened under Mulrooney, and there were some concerns with what happened with the free trade agreement and its impact on Canadians, loss of manufacturing jobs and those kinds of things, which of course contribute to loss of revenue to the federal government, which reduces their ability to intervene in the economy.
So it's you think it was late 80s, early 90s when we started turning around and losing funding for social services.
That's right. The investment that was made in social housing has expired. And many of those organizations that had funds for social housing, they had a 25-year window. That funding is now expiring, and many of these organizations, these not-for-profits, are in trouble now because that money is gone and it's not being reinvested in social housing. We know that, I'm just using housing as a very small example, we know that social housing as an investment reduces healthcare costs, it reduces time people spend in prison, it reduces welfare costs, and yet we don't have a government that recognizes that their reduction in spending there is actually costing them money somewhere else. So these are important factors, and the NDP is committed to those kinds of things.
So how would NDP change this social housing erosion that in the 90s and through the 90s there was the co-op movement, and CMHC was funding all these co-ops, which created a lot of social housing. How would the NDP change this?
Well, in fact, Libby Davies, the member of Parliament for Vancouver East, had a bill before Parliament with regards to a national housing strategy and investments in social housing, and working with provinces and municipalities and First Nations, you would develop that strategy and develop the investment that was required. That bill was defeated in the House of Commons. So we have a bill that lays out that targets, funding, working relationships with other levels of government in order to have that social housing. So we've got a concrete example of what we would do with regards to housing. Back in 2005, I know that's a while ago, when the Paul Martin Liberal government was in the process of looking like it was going to be defeated, we negotiated a significant sum of money that was to go back into housing in the 2005 budget in order for us to support the Liberal government at that time from being defeated. And we negotiated a total of $4 point something billion that went into a number of areas, including housing. And so we already have a track record of recognizing that housing is an investment and that we should be putting money into that.
So some people will argue that to put more money into social housing, somebody has to pay taxes. And the opponents to social services will say, who will pay for it? How would you respond to those people that say, we don't want to pay more taxes?
Well, of course, people don't want to pay more taxes, but spending is always about priorities. So you look at the existing multi-billion-dollar budget that the federal government has, and you determine what your priorities are. And you can reallocate spending from one area to another. So, for example, we subsidize oil and gas corporations by several $billion a year. Why not put some of that money into things like renewable energy, into social housing? So you set your priorities. But I would also argue that taxpayers are paying for the lack of social housing already, with increased healthcare costs, with increased costs for the justice system, with increased costs in other social services. So they need to recognize that it's not a zero-sum game. It's not we just put more money in and that's the only thing you have to think about.
So you think people should be educated about the reason why, if there is some increase in taxes, why is it beneficial to ourselves?
Well, and it's not just about an increase in taxes. It's about the fact that you're spending money in other areas because people don't have adequate housing. It's cheaper to put somebody in a house than to keep them on the street. And there have been a number of studies that have demonstrated that. It wasn't about people being homeless, but there was a housing project here in Nanaimo a number of years ago. What they did was they did a healthcare study pre and post. So this housing project was designed to house people who may have mental health issues, maybe some other issues. And what they did is they studied the healthcare costs before people were in this supported housing unit. And of course, before the housing unit was built, hospital admissions were higher, length of stay was higher, all of those kinds of things. And then after people were in this supported housing, so it was social housing, but it was supported, then they studied the healthcare costs again. No surprise to anybody in the field. Hospital admissions went down, and when people were admitted, their length of stay was far shorter. So there was a savings to the healthcare system by having this supported housing. So it didn't cost more money.
No, I see what you're saying, but I wonder if a lot of people understand that.
Well, we need to educate.
That's right. We have to talk about it, and then people will see your side saying it's not just more taxes, it's how do you spend what you already have. And how can you find out that people do understand that and would support those changes and therefore would vote for your platform?
Well, it is difficult to engage people in more complex policy discussions. That's a reality. People are more and more attuned to the 30-second soundbite or the 140 characters on Twitter. But I think that what we need to say to people is, part of our responsibility of being Canadian citizens, it's a responsibility to make sure that it's a just and fair society. I would say it's a responsibility of citizenship. And so one of the things that we have to say to people is that we need to make sure our neighbors are looked after. As we keep communities safer for people who are less advantaged, we keep communities safer for everybody and healthier for everybody. And I think that's the argument that we have to present to people, is to help them understand there's a cost to them for not doing this.
Yes. Now, if people understand that and say, yes, we want to vote NDP for that specific reason, is there a possibility of you having a plebiscite before elections and see whether people really support your proposal? That makes a lot of sense, but people might not be there. So would the plebiscite tell you how much support you're going to have in your policies?
Well, it would be difficult to do a plebiscite between now and October. The reality is they're very costly, and in order to be done properly, you need to be able to have a good sample. People would argue that with all the polling that's going on with the various polling firms, in effect, you have a plebiscite on what party policies are. However, those of us in British Columbia who were here for the last provincial election understand that polling numbers are completely
Up in the air.
up in the air and can be misleading.
Yes. Yes.
I think that what our job is to continue to put out the information. Tom Mulcair was in Nanaimo last week talking about a part of what his plan for action was. And I think we need to continue to be putting it out on our web pages, on social media, to say this is what we stand for. This is what you get if you have an NDP government, and continue to use those mechanisms to get the information out. Programs like yours to get the message out.
Yeah, I think information is one of a three-legged stool. Information, you need to know what you're voting for. But I think the other leg of this stool is actually a mechanism of finding out where people are. And that you can get through plebiscites, polling. Now, the polling that we were talking about before, that sometimes they're completely wrong, like they were in the elections or BC elections last time. That kind of polling is private companies that run questions with their own bias. So they're not real tools to measure public opinion, because whoever's paying the pollster to carry this referendum or this plebiscite or this poll, they are basically asking the question in a certain way that is going to get the vote that they want. Would NDP consider running a mechanism for a perpetual polling where you can continuously have the pulse of the people, where people stand after you give the education? The other is to less the mechanism for bringing that public opinion up on the stage. Do you think that that's possible?
I don't think it's possible. Again, for the reasons that I already said, that it's very costly to do it, and but we are constantly measuring the pulse of people that we represent. I mean, it's not a formal survey, but talking to people, going to events, we'll often send out mail out information that people can write their comments on and send back to us. We also have, I haven't done it here, but in other places they've done focus groups to talk to people about what's important to them. So we are judging whether or not people are taking up our message, but it's a less formal, less structured way of doing it. I mean, the Conservatives can afford to do mega polling because they have got pots of money to do this. It's very expensive.
Yeah, well, and then those pollings again are made by a private company that is paid by a party. So if you hire a private company to do your polling, most likely they're going to try to please you because they want another contract. So either Conservatives or NDP or trade unions or whoever does that polling. What I'm suggesting is a party that starts their own polling, even a non-partisan polling would be even better.
Again, if we could find a way to fund that, I think that's a great idea. The challenge is how do you fund it, because it's very expensive.
Yes, I hear that all the time. There are countries in the world that have 100% free education. And I recently heard about Germany having university education free. And I've heard for many years Cuba having 100% education of universities. Even foreigners go in and study medicine over there, and then they go back to their country from third world countries as well as from Canada and the United States. England has a lot of free education in universities. Do you think it's possible for Canada or for your party to promote free education from daycare all the way to PhD?
Well, what we have advocated for is a more robust grants and contribution system that makes it much more affordable. I mean, we have been out in the forefront about the problems that students have in terms of the huge student loan debt. but we haven't advocated for free education. But we certainly have advocated for appropriate transfers to post-secondary institutions from the federal government in order to keep the costs down for students. We would like to see the Canada Student Loan and the grants and contributions program revamped so students don't end up with these crushing debt burdens when they graduate. And we absolutely need to look at access for lower income folks, because there's something called sticker shock. And people look at the cost for tuition fees and then they just exclude themselves from even going, because they don't see themselves as ever being able to repay those what the cost of what it would take for them to go to school. So I think you need a range of options to take a look at to make sure that it's affordable.
What is the reason for which the NDP would not advocate absolutely free education all the way to university? Is that an economic issue?
Well, it is an economic issue in terms of, again, setting your priorities around spending. I think you're probably aware that we have advocated for a child care program that would cap fees at $15 a day for child care, which would then allow people to go to school if they were parents. They wouldn't have this barrier about how to look after their kids if they go to school. And again, we want to see a more robust grants program, forgivable grants, forgivable contributions program that makes it more affordable for students. I mean, the reality of it is that the Canadian Federation of Students and other student movements have not been advocating for free tuition. They've been advocating for more affordable tuition and for more robust programs. And so we've been working with the Canadian Federation of Students in proposing what they see as being a realistic program that would help students access universities and colleges.
Mm-hmm. It is puzzling to me, because I see other countries saying we pay for it and we wanna free education all the way. Here in Canada, you're right. Students associations don't advocate for free. They advocate. One year I hear them saying we want to freeze the increases. In other words, it's okay the way it is. We just don't want to make it higher, that tuition fee.
Well, they're actually not saying it's okay as it is. What they're recognizing is in this climate, with the kinds of governments that we have, there is no way that they're going to get more affordable tuitions. So they're at least they're positioning themselves in the current political climate. They recognize that many students are completely disadvantaged in terms of going to school.
What is that political climate you're talking about? Is it people's understanding of the economics of social services, and could it be corrected?
Well, in part it's a conservative mindset, where it's every man, woman, and child for themselves. And if you can't afford to go to school, it's somehow your fault in a conservative mindset. They disregard the fact that there are many people who simply do not have the ability to save money for a tuition fees because their wages are too low, or they come from single parent families, a whole variety of reasons why people can't save for education. And in the conservative universe, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They are prepared to write off a whole segment of the population in terms of access to education because it doesn't fit their frame. And they'll talk about the fact that they've got registered educational savings plans and whatnot. But let me tell you, if you're making minimum wage, you've got no money to put into an RESP. So parents can't save for their children's education. So that's the reality of what students are facing.
I look at these other countries that do have education free, and I think the mindset is that education is a human right. So there is no economic issue there. We pay for it, period.
Well, the Conventions of the Rights of the Child do talk about education as a human right.
That's
the
right.
Convention of the Rights of the Child, what conservative governments will argue is that Convention of the Rights of the Child only cover you up until the age of 16, and after that it doesn't cover you. So therefore, post-secondary education isn't a factor. That's what conservatives will tell you.
Yeah. Well, but in other countries they say education
absolutely.
to PhD. We can be 100 years old and still go free to university or take
in
courses.
fact, it's changing the conversation to talk about education as an investment. But people
are not there.
They're not there.
Okay.
They're not there.
How do we get the message to people that, in fact, other countries think it's a human right, and why don't we think the same way?
Again, it's a longer term process. It's about educating people. It's about bringing them on board. It's about getting them to see the reality of what happens when you educate people. I mean, we know that the way out of poverty is through education.
Yeah.
You know, we know that.
You wouldn't have a plebiscite on free education all the way to PhD?
But again, you know, a plebiscite, it's a referendum.
Referendum is binding by the government.
Yeah.
A plebiscite is non-binding. It's like a poll.
But a poll around whether or not people would agree about education is free is not going to make education free. And just because, but the reason I'm saying that is that we know on so many pieces of legislation that the Conservative government has brought forward that Canadians are opposed to it. It doesn't mean that people back away from the legislation. So if a plebiscite was being used as an educational tool to raise people's awareness, and whether it would have the kind of reach in order to get people to engage in it, I think there's a whole bunch of other questions. I'm not convinced that plebiscites are the way to raise awareness. Right? It's an interesting tool, but...
I was more thinking in the line of taking the pulse. You know, say how many beats is your heart going? How fast is your heart going? And if you say the Conservatives are thinking that people are not there, I'm thinking maybe the public would surprise them to say, yes, we are there. You just never took the pulse. You never asked us. So it's our gut feeling that they want to prove it, but can you prove that? Can you put
Well, I can prove it with numbers of pieces of legislation that they've ran through despite there's huge opposition.
The people didn't do it. That's the government.
No, but Canadians have said, don't do this. Today, as we speak, there are rallies across this country on Bill C-51, on their bill on terror. Do you think the Conservatives are going to listen to that?
No, because...
No, of course they're not. So Canadians are going to say, we don't want it. And Conservatives are going to say, tough luck, you're going to get it.
You elected us.
You elected us. Right?
We have full power to do whatever we want. That's why I think that referendums and plebiscites would change that type of politics. Because
I guess you have more faith in that than I do.
Faith in the people.
I have lots of faith in the people.
Yeah.
I don't have faith that the government of the day will listen to a plebiscite.
Well, you don't have to be in government to do that. The NDP could do plebiscites.
No, but I'm saying, say a nonpartisan organization had a plebiscite that said that Canadians want free education. I have no confidence that the government would actually pay any attention to that.
That's right.
So that's my dilemma with it, right?
It is a problem. I think that it could educate the government to see that the vast majority of people are not really supporting the rules, the legislation that they're bringing in. So it would be kind of confronting the government. Why are you doing this when it's not just a rally? Because in a rally you don't count how many people go there. But in a plebiscite you would count. You would say there's 66% of people opposed to what you're doing. Then you have a number. Transportation, and in some places they have fare-free transportation, and of course that is a more municipal thing than federal, but federal funding helps to do the infrastructure and sometimes supporting the operations of transit, at least the infrastructure. And in Seattle they have fare-free downtown train. People jump in and out of the train. In Calgary they have the same thing, fare-free trains in the downtown area. And I always thought if they can do it in the downtown area, they can do in the whole city, because it's just a matter of enlarging whatever system they have in the downtown core. Do you think that giving fare-free transportation would be a social service that would benefit a lot of lower income people and also the environment?
Yeah, I mean, transportation is good for the economy. Like the bottom line is, it's good for the economy, it's good for the environment. We're one of the few Western countries that does not have a national transportation strategy. You know, our federal government is absent in that field. And you're absolutely right. It's both a provincial and a municipal government responsibility. But the federal government could demonstrate leadership by working with the provinces and municipalities to develop a national transportation strategy, to talk about what investment in transportation should look like across this country, and they should certainly be at the table. Because it is, you're right, it is very mixed in Canada with regards to whether we actually have public transportation in cities, and then what the costs that are for running it.
Yeah. What is the plan for the NDP on transportation?
Well, we called for a national transit strategy. We've been doing that for a number of years. We want the federal government to come to the table and work with provinces and municipalities to develop a transportation strategy across this country, to talk about what those investments should look like.
Do you have a specific strategy in mind, or are you just calling for a discussion about a strategy?
Well, the specifics around, you need to work with the other levels of government because they're deliverers of service. You can't impose a national vision on provinces and municipalities. So you do need to work with them, and you do need to invest money.
Okay. Do you think that NDPs would make policies any different than what the Liberals are doing?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, give me an example.
Where would you like to start? We would actually have a national housing strategy. We would actually have a national transit strategy. We would actually invest in education and healthcare, which they pulled funds back from in 1995 and 96. Okay. Right. So those are very different than what the Liberal approach has been.
So there are differences between NDP and Liberal, because I see a lot of politicians from the NDP jumping over to the Liberals and vice versa, and I thought maybe, well, Ujaldo Sanch was our premier here in BC, and he became
you can't mix, I mean, federal and provincial parties can be quite different. I mean, the NDP is more aligned provincially with the NDP, but the provincial Liberals, for example, are nothing like the federal Liberals. I mean, the provincial Liberals are really conservatives, right? So, and I have to say, in some cases, people make those jumps for opportunistic reasons. They'll look at the seat that they're running in, recognize that it's been a Liberal seat forever, and decide that they're going to run for the Liberals rather than for the NDP. So, you know, just because Bob Rae and Ujjal Dosanjh jumped to the Liberals, I don't think that's an indicator that our policies are similar.
Yeah, and Emerson, I was thinking, that went from Liberal to Conservative. Do you think that people should have the right to recall their MPs?
Sure. But I also think if you're going to do that, you need to make it a realistic threshold. We've seen the recall campaigns in British Columbia with there's provincial recall legislation, but it's almost impossible to reach that threshold.
40% signatures they want from the previous voters. What would you lower it down to 10% or?
I think I don't know what the percentage would be, but I think it has to be high enough that it's not frivolous, but low enough that it's manageable if there's widespread dissatisfaction. I don't know what that magic number would be, but it has to be achievable. And when we have such low voter turnout, when you get a voter turnout that's in the 50%, to get 40% to do a recall is pretty unrealistic.
No, I just throw this 10% because in Venezuela they have this recall. And when Chavez was alive, he was actually on recall. They called him for re-election 2 years within his mandate, but it was 10%. And I thought here 40% is a little too onerous. Maybe
I would agree 40% is too onerous. I just think I don't know what that magic number would be.
Hi everybody, do you have an opinion? If you do, go to nowpolling.ca and register it now. That's nowpolling.ca.